Hey, what's up, everybody? Mike Singer, blueandgold.com, joined by our beat writer, Patrick Engel, to discuss all things Notre Dame's 2020 football schedule. Patrick has been crushing the scheduling content and breaking down what it means. So if you haven't been reading our content at blueandgold.com, make sure to head to that website. All sorts of good stuff there. Especially your takeaways story, Patrick. Clemson setup, traps, no Navy, and more. Takeaways from the Irish's new schedule. That was a great story that Patrick wrote on Thursday, so make sure to check that out. But, of course, we're going to get some of Patrick's thoughts and breaking down the schedule. So I'll read it off real quick to start here, guys. Duke, it's the season opener now, September 12th. And then the 2 weeks. Is that right? 2 weeks right after? Oh, no. Okay. So you got sorry, I was skipping ahead to Wake Forest. And
Western
you got
Michigan
Western
is
Michigan. Yep, September 19th. So 2 home games to start the season for Notre Dame. September 26th at Wake Forest, then a bye week. So right there to start the season, not the strongest opponents, and then a bye week, and then you get Florida State October 10th. I'm sure we'll get into Kevin Austin and how this schedule sets up nicely for his return. Louisville at home, October 17th. So the first 6 weeks of the season, you have one road game, Patrick. One road game. And that's in Charlotte. So a neat venue for the Irish. And then you got at Pitt, October 24th, at Georgia Tech on Halloween. And then you host Clemson November 7th, at Boston College November 14th. And then you got an open week November 21st. And then you got a Friday game at North Carolina and home for Syracuse December 5th. So for our YouTube audience, I've had this video put up. For our audio audience, wanted to read that off for you guys. Of course, if you're watching this video via YouTube, please like and subscribe. That really helps out our channel. And if you listen via podcast, of course, you can find us wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify, Google, whatever. If you want to support our podcast or leave us a voice message with questions or feedback, please go to Anchor. Yes, like the boat, like a boat anchor, anchor.fm/blueandgold. Okay, so Patrick, when you first see the schedule released, which was early Thursday morning, what was your initial reaction?
Well, yeah, you talk about the easy start, and it's like easy's putting it mildly. I mean, they could kind of sleepwalk into this for a month, really, and have a chance of getting through it unscathed. And just with opening against Duke, who at least last year it was really not much of a challenge for them. Western Michigan, again, really should not be much of a challenge, even if you're, semi-alert. Wake Forest has made 4 straight bowl games, but still 81st in the preseason SP Plus, which takes into account a lot of recent recruiting and returning production, a lot of offensive losses there that they're going to have to kind of deal with. And even if that's in Duke, you can say the same thing for too. Teams that go the equivalent of 7-5 over this 11-game season, still ones that Notre Dame really should be able to handle. And of those first 3 opponents, Duke is the highest ranked in the preseason SP Plus at 69th. Florida State, of course, tougher game just considering the NFL talent they have. They had 5 guys in Pro Football Focus's early top 50 for the 2021 draft, but still breaking in a new coach, 18-20 the last 3 years. Even a talented-ish team came up to Notre Dame in 2018 and just got boat raced by a Notre Dame team that we think this 2020 iteration is going to be at least in the neighborhood of. I don't know about predicting 11-0 in this case, just like they went 12-0, but certainly the team has a ceiling to be really good. And of course, the other thing you look at is the placement of the Clemson game, and that's about as favorable an outcome as Notre Dame could have asked for, because it didn't change.
Yeah.
And everything gets them in the cold. And now I'm of the belief that weather's often an overblown factor. But if you have the choice
Anything
of,
helps.
okay, we'll take a team from South Carolina and have them play in September, like I honestly, I would have thought this could be a game that the ACC puts on the first weekend of the year, or have them come up in November. You take the November one just because what if it's really cold, and what if that does end up being a thing, even if more often than not that's something that gets a lot of discussed, pregame, and really doesn't end up being that much. So that works out pretty well. And another kind of factor that more discussed, often overblown, but still something that if you have the choice, there's one obvious outcome. Clemson had an off week before it was supposed to come to Notre Dame on originally November 7th, still November 7th. That off week is no longer there. They're going to play Boston College. Again, the thing that a lot of times doesn't matter. And even now I would still kind of caution into of you never know when a game's going to get canceled, going to have to get moved, the team is dealing with an outbreak, when a bye week might be filled, when an open week might come up because of a cancellation. But those little factors of things that maybe help out and just kind of take what you can get to play a number one team in all likelihood. Clemson's pre-Notre Dame schedule is really easy, and they will almost certainly open as the top team in the country across most polls. They're already number one in the coaches poll. So all of those little factors for that Clemson game set up pretty well for the Irish.
And Clemson plays 5 straight games before they play Notre Dame. So they open at Wake Forest, and they have a non-conference game, and then a bye week. And then from October 3rd to Halloween, it's home against Virginia, home against Miami, at Georgia Tech, Syracuse, Boston College, and those latter two home. So they don't get much of a break there. Notre Dame plays 4 consecutive games before Clemson, but of course Notre Dame gets Clemson at home. You mentioned the weather factor might not be major, but I mean, I talked to recruits from the South who went up to Notre Dame last November, and that's not one of their favorite things about the Notre Dame visit is the weather in November. So could it have been more favorable if it was the last game of the season, or that Thanksgiving week or something like that? Then maybe. But yeah, November 7th.
Clemson would have showed up to the ACC offices in Greensboro with pitchforks and Molotovs if that game at Notre Dame was scheduled for the last game of the year. That was no way that was happening. But all told, yeah, a nice thing that could help Notre Dame. We don't know. Yeah, I mean, we, like you said, it's not something those warm weather teams enjoy doing, even if good ones still more often than not can figure it out.
Sure. So let's stay on the Clemson route. I mean, are you surprised that with this game and really Notre Dame's season and schedule that the ACC was so favorable? Or do you think it's like, look, the ACC's got so many teams to make this work, so it just was a coincidence that the schedule was favorable for Notre Dame? Like, what's your take on that?
I mean, no matter how you stacked it up, this was going to be an easy schedule. Like, we knew all the opponents already, and it was going to be easy just because the ACC's been the worst Power 5 league the last couple of years.
Don't say that. Pac-12 has been bad.
No, last year, the ACC, both divisions ranked below one of the American Conference divisions in Sagarin's strength of division and strength of conference metric. So the numbers will tell you it's been the worst Power 5 conference. And now I'm even one of the belief that it could actually take a bit of a jump this year, just with a number of teams that you kind of like, some pieces coming back, with Florida State, talented. Mike Norvell can coach, at least he could in Memphis. We'll see what happens there. But there's at least, intrigue or upward momentum with a lot of these. Yeah, I would even say the same thing a little bit about Miami, although losing Gregory Rousseau, the top 10 likely pick next year, and the ACC sack leader next year doesn't help. But still enough of those where you can say, yeah, I can see these teams, like, again, if you went in a normal season, maybe winning 9 games or something. Of course, North Carolina.
North Carolina, Louisville. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of teams. I mean, hopefully even for Georgia Tech's sake that they're in another year under their new coach. So yeah, I agree with you there.
Right. And so it could be a thing that, I don't expect it to stay this way. These conferences just kind of operate in cycles. And this was just a, downward or the bottom part of a cycle. I mean, we're forgetting 4 years ago, the ACC was probably the deepest league in the Power Five. So it's, you can easily see that kind of changing and upswinging. But at the same time, I don't know if there's anybody in here that's going to be, top 10 good outside of Clemson and possibly Notre Dame, of course, but can't play yourself. And Notre Dame is 14-1 against non-Clemson teams in the last 3 years. Non-Clemson ACC teams, that is.
Right.
So it was going to be games, no matter where you put them or how you arranged them, unless you put Clemson on there 11 times, that Notre Dame's going to be favored against, that it's usually way higher in the recruiting rankings against, that Notre Dame has played those teams that have been, some of the better versions of themselves in recent years and still handled them really well. Like Syracuse, of course, not really thinking much about that game as the last game of the year in December. They weren't very good last year, but just a couple of years ago, they were 10-3 and the ACC's second best team, and Notre Dame beat them by 33. The game's never close. So here's kind of what I look at and just kind of explaining that how Notre Dame has been good against the ACC's kind of second tier, or it's like second or third best teams, if you want to call it. So of that 14-1 record against regular season ACC opponents since 2017, 3 of those wins have come against teams that finished in the top 25 of the final college football playoff, top 25. Notre Dame beat them by 69 combined points. So it's played good, or at least good in a vacuum, and good for whatever the ACC has been recently, ACC teams, and still handled them without really much trouble. I mean, if we think back to that Syracuse game in 2018, they finished at number 20, I believe. Not really much of a contest. North Carolina State in 2017, they finished right in the back end of the top 25. I think that was a 3-touchdown win. And then most recently, last year, Virginia won the Coastal Division, went to the Orange Bowl. Close for a little while, but still ended up as a 15-point win. And they've just found a way to win those games. And, I
rather
don't
easily.
Really see, right. I don't really see that changing unless it's something with Notre Dame internally where, for whatever reason, it just doesn't end up being as good as it has been the last 3 years, or that we think it will be again.
So, Patrick, looking at the schedule, obviously Clemson's the one that everyone's going to circle as the biggest game of the year for the Irish. And we've talked about before, we don't need to get into too deep of this because it's pretty obvious. Clemson's the game you got to win. But even if you don't beat Clemson November 7th, if you win all the other games, you're going to probably face Clemson in the ACC Championship game. If you beat them there, you're still probably good. So, but looking at the rest of the schedule, what games do you think could give Notre Dame or should give Notre Dame fans some concern? For me, there's a few that I'll look at as could be pretty competitive. Louisville, that's going to be a game at home. But that's one last year. Louisville, we weren't sure what they were going to look like with Satterfield, their new coach, and Notre Dame had an easy time with that one. I think they won by like 19 points, and then Louisville ended up winning like 8 or 9 games last year. So they're supposed to be better this year. Notre Dame gets them at home, but Louisville could be a team that's improved to go at Pitt, which before all of this happened, we're still circled that one. That was still going to be at in Pittsburgh. So that's one that I think you might have some concern about. And then North Carolina on the road on a Friday night. That's been a good team who's not only recruited well, but took Clemson to the wire last year, and they should be better. Are you concerned? I mean, Florida State, you mentioned that's a wild card, but those are really the 3, Louisville, Pitt, and North Carolina, that I'm looking at as potential trip-ups for Notre Dame. What's your take when I say that?
So with all those you mentioned, and if you want to throw Florida State in there too, one of them will probably be some white knuckler, last minute, one possession, whatever, outcome of the game that's not certain until, the final minute, basically. Just because there's been one of those per year for Notre Dame. Just last year with Virginia Tech, a couple of years ago with Pitt. So just odds on you're going to see that, especially because it's hard to blow out, every solid team you face. But the one that I would be concerned about, or that will at least have the worst consequences of a loss, would be North Carolina. And it's not because that would be a bad loss, like, oh, you lost to a bad team. No, like, North Carolina's going to end up in most people's preseason top 25s or top 20s or whatever you want to call it. Quarterback who's back after setting a true freshman record for touchdown passes last year, and Sam Howell. But it's because of the kind of compromised position Notre Dame could have itself in if it loses that game, which North Carolina doesn't play Clemson. And if you beat Notre Dame, North Carolina has actually the easiest ACC schedule when you look at total opponent preseason S&P plus. So not having Clemson, there's just a game that you're not playing that you'd be expected to lose. And so let's say North Carolina beats Notre Dame. That hands Notre Dame a loss, which means to overcome North Carolina to get in the ACC title game, like, let's just assume for a minute Clemson's going. North Carolina's got to lose 2 games against that schedule. That's a big ask. And where you set it up in the last game of the year, you don't really have much of a margin for error if you drop it, because there's only one more week, or sorry, not last game of the year, second to last game of the year. Only one more week to get the help you need, which is North Carolina taking a loss. And if Notre Dame comes into that with, let's say it had lost to Clemson, and all of a sudden, let's say you lose the game in North Carolina, you've got to bank on North Carolina already having 2 losses at that point, or
just to make the ACC
right, exactly. In that case,
championship.
Right, they would just not be. They wouldn't finish in the top 2, and so let's say even if Carolina has 1 loss going into that, it beats Notre Dame, hands Notre Dame a second loss, that wipes out Notre Dame from the title game. But I think it's still one that Notre Dame should be favored to win.
Oh, for sure.
Win. Again, it's maybe, we're still sleeping on North Carolina, even though everybody's projecting them to go from 7-6 to, a top 25 team. All right, if they end up being a top 10 team, then, who knows? But again, let's just say it's something in the neighborhood of a, 9-3, safely top 25, whatever. Those are still games Notre Dame's been able to take care of business in.
Sure. It's the Clemson game.
Right. It really is.
Sure.
And with all those other ones like, Louisville, Pitt, Florida State, whatever, I don't really know, what's their path to being great in a sense. Like, all of these, you're still looking at them and you say, yeah, they were good and they took, especially Louisville and Pitt, steps, but Louisville's defense, not great. I think it was in the 80s in SP plus at the end of last year, as far as actually how it played. Pitt's offense was just brutal. We talk about Boston College even as the trap game because it's after Clemson and it's on the road. They were one of the worst Power 5 defenses out there. So, you have to be able to, either stop Notre Dame or score on them. In Pitt's case, we're talking about an offense that was just not competitive. It's a long way up to go from, in Boston College's case, the 120s in total defense, or Pitt's case, losing 3 games where it allowed 3 touchdowns or less, including Pitt lost to Boston College when that same bad Boston College defense had scored 19 points on it. So I don't see how they're going to get any worse. And I can say the same thing for Louisville as I can too about Pitt, because all of the main pieces of their really good unit, Louisville's offense was really good, are back. But you got a long way to go to be able to take some of those areas of either being able to score enough points on Notre Dame to beat them or slow them down enough to have a shot.
So Patrick,
we'll see.
So a couple more things for you. When you look at like North Carolina, you mentioned they don't play Clemson. Obviously Notre Dame does. would you rather Notre Dame play Clemson in the regular season or not? When you look at, does that help or hurt their chances to make a national championship? Like, would you say it's better that they just have the perfect easy schedule in the ACC? Because obviously it'd be easier if you take Clemson off of there. Or do you think it's good that they have them in the regular season?
I think you play them, especially because the upside if you beat them is you're pretty much locking in a spot. Like, if Notre Dame beats Clemson and takes the loss to North Carolina, you're going to be
in the ACC Championship.
Thing. Right. Yeah, exactly. Because let's say Clemson's only loss is that one at Notre Dame. Notre Dame's, loses to North Carolina. You're in, I think. And that's assuming, Notre Dame or North Carolina either, goes undefeated or something and just locks up the top spot, or takes a loss somewhere else and there's tiebreakers. But you're going to feel really good about if you beat Clemson, you're going to feel really, really good about the chances to be in the title game. And on one hand, maybe it's, difficult to think, we still feel like we got to beat them again to make sure you get in the playoff. And maybe that's true. Like, it's hard to beat Clemson twice. It's hard to beat them once. But no matter how you shake it, no matter where, the game it is, if it's in the ACC Championship game or the regular season, win over Clemson's a big deal for a playoff resume. And even if you beat them in the regular season, lose to them in the ACC title game, you have a really good win on the schedule either way. Yeah. And that's going to still carry some weight with, in the playoff. And of course, this all depends on what happens in other conferences and everything. And that's obviously out of everybody's control. But you want to play them because of the upside that happens if you actually beat them. And I would imagine Clemson's going to be favored, but will anyone be just completely floored if Notre Dame beats them in South Bend? Probably not. I won't. It's not going to be some, upset like a MAC team, beating somebody in the Big Ten or something.
A couple of thoughts. For one, if Notre Dame loses to Clemson, like we mentioned earlier, their goals are still ahead of them. As long as you go into that Clemson game with an unbeaten record, you beat Clemson. We'll just beat them again in the ACC Championship game, and then hopefully there's not just a bunch of unbeatens across the country that as a one-loss team we can't get in, because it's going to be hard to beat Notre Dame twice if you're Clemson too. Yeah. So I think that's a real thing. So it's almost like that Clemson Notre Dame game is kind of like a game where you feel each other out, because it's not the loser of that game, again, assuming that they're both unbeaten and then that they can win the rest of their games on the schedule. It's kind of just like a round one almost. And another thing, if Notre Dame beats Clemson and finishes the regular season unbeaten, and let's say North Carolina only has one loss, so then you would have Notre Dame at the very top, and then North Carolina and Clemson with both one loss. And then who knows, like you mentioned kind of earlier with the tiebreaker scenarios, what if Notre Dame doesn't have to see Clemson in the ACC Championship game? What if it's North Carolina they play again? That would be bizarre. I don't know if they've put out the tiebreaker scenarios yet. Is that something they've published?
I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know how a tiebreaker would look if you have one loss Clemson and one loss North Carolina with both of those losses in Notre Dame. That would be a pretty ideal setup.
Yeah, if Notre Dame.
Either way, you're looking at a chance at a second really good win.
Yeah.
But not feeling like you have to beat Clemson again.
So there's the perfect scenario. Notre Dame doesn't have to play Clemson again, and they beat them in November.
Exactly.
Because the tiebreakers, you would just hope that it's not up to some discretion of the ACC, because if it's between North Carolina and Clemson, they get to pick. Obviously, they're going to send Clemson. One last thing for you, Patrick. Western Michigan is the non-conference game and not Navy. What can you tell us about why it was the Broncos and not Navy?
Yeah, I think that ultimately, came down to just wanting to keep it simple and not try to mess with anything. I know Jack Swarbrick has reportedly said that, or at least in a couple of interviews he's done since then, where it's, all right, we just wanted to, hey, thankful for the opportunity. Let's not, mess around and try to ask the ACC for an exception to play Navy, or kick around our agreement with Navy where we got to flip home games or whatever. I think they could have done that part if they really wanted to. I mean, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it makes sense to just have the easier opponent, keep them at home. Notre Dame has 6 home games, 4 road games.
Right. And this is, I don't know what it's the determining factor, but by playing Western Michigan, you don't have to worry about getting out of that contract or any kind of mess that would follow there. So I'm of the belief that if Notre Dame and Navy really wanted to make it work, they could have done something that gets the game in Indiana this year in exchange for something down the road. That's a lot easier than it sounds than it actually is to do. Sure. You got to make sure everybody has the right number of home games and home TV things, especially for Notre Dame having 7 NBC dates. But who knows? And it's kind of one of those things where, all right, this is what we got to do. And looking at Notre Dame is, here's our schedule. We've got to play the one team in our state. We have it on the schedule. Let's just do this and not make it complicated. And just hope you can actually play all the games.
Yeah, you don't have to prepare for the triple option. And like I said, you get another home game as well. So Western Michigan is obviously a lot easier of an opponent than Navy. And it's not like beating Navy is going to make Notre Dame fans rejoice. And it was also interesting to note, like 3 hours after the schedule came out, Notre Dame renewed its series or with Navy for another 15 years
it extended it another 6 years. Yeah, it was already through 2026.
Okay.
Going through 2032 now.
Okay. Well, there it is. Well, that's the schedule. That's the schedule breakdown. Again, if you like this video, like and subscribe on YouTube. Podcast version, thank you very much for listening via that platform. We have exciting things coming at blueandgold.com, so make sure to tune in. If you like us on podcast and you want to try us out on YouTube, you can see these pretty faces. If you'd prefer podcast version, you usually watch on YouTube. Again, anchor.fm/blueandgold, and then there's a bunch of different available platforms that we're on. You can find the links there, whether it's Google, Apple, Spotify, Overcast. There's a bunch of different podcast platforms we're on. So again, thank you so much for listening or watching this video.